It's October, it's Halloween, it is time for a scary read. I asked everyone on the channel to vote in a community post what book I should read for October and for Halloween. It was close, but you guys picked The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And I am so glad you did. It has rapidly become one of, if not perhaps, my favourite horror novel. When famous actress Chris MacNeil's usually lovely, smart, sweet, intelligent young daughter starts becoming violent, starts having convulsions and spasms, she becomes worried. But then it becomes increasingly violent. She gets vulgar language thrown at her. She begins spasming uncontrollably. She begins speaking with imaginary friends. She begins seeing things in rooms that aren't there. And she begins physically mutilating herself. Chris becomes desperate for any help she can get. Exhausting the options available to her in the medical field, she turns to the only options she thinks she has left, spiritual ones. She enlists the help of another troubled individual nearby, Father Karras, a Jesuit priest, a trained psychologist, and recently, a skeptic, a man who's questioning his faith, his life, and his path. And together, they try and see if they can't find the solution to poor Regan's problems. So obviously The Exorcist has a very famous movie, a movie I had seen several times, in fact. I love this movie, before going into the book. So I knew most of what to expect, and I would say that the storyline is pretty much beat for beat, right? It's not identical in any way, but it is telling exactly the same story. It is just kind of the vibe that I get from both of them that are slightly different. The movie is slightly less subtle, I think, with the horror elements, and it works perfectly for what it is, a shorter telling of the same story on the screen. And the book is a bit more drawn out, a bit more subtle, a bit more human, I would say. To answer the obvious question that everyone asks, is the movie or is the book better? I think that's hard here. I think it's really close. I think I prefer the book, but very slightly. I wouldn't argue with anyone who said the movie was better than the book in this case. Look, let's just jump right in with the things that I really loved about this book. First off, it's a horror book, and it's a horror book that's genuinely scary. I think I've talked about this before, but genuinely, I don't find horror books or even horror shows or games that scary. They can be disturbing, they can be a bit creepy, but they're not palm sweaty, scared of the dark, after you put the book down, like genuinely, you know, icky in the gut feeling scary. I think this book, at times, really is. There's one scene in particular that the movie does slightly differently. I think it's done slightly better in the book. But I got the creeps. I felt tingles and shivers when it happened. I think Regan might be the best horror antagonist, protagonist, victim, evil, whatever it is she is. I think she might be the best version of that I've read. Which leads into the second strong point, is the characters. The characters are amazing in this. They're all written really, really well. And what's more, they're kind of a subversion of my expectation of these characters, right? In a book like this, I expect a rational mother who's trying to do what's best for her child by taking her to every doctor she can see, by getting rid of the crazy spiritual talking people. And I'm expecting a priest who's jumping at ghosts, who's trying to link every single piece of evidence to scripture and to God and to religion. But here we have a priest who is very hesitant to admit that there's anything going wrong. Throughout the whole thing, Father Karras is trying to prove that this can't be a possession, that there needs to be no exorcism. This is medical in nature, and he can prove it. He's going through books, he's researching sources, he's talking to experts, proving each step of the way that this is just mundane, it's nothing supernatural, we don't need to be performing an exorcism here. Meanwhile, Chris, she's a mother whose daughter is doing terrible things and is in a terrible state health-wise, and she is desperate. Even if maybe deep down she doesn't believe in things like exorcism and possessions, anything that might help her daughter she's grabbing at. She needs something to hold on to. She needs someone to tell her what's wrong with Regan. And then of course there's kind of like the third tertiary character in Detective Kinderman, who is investigating a series of disturbances and events around the church, and then later on in the book investigating incidents and whatnot around Regan and around the McNeil house. And his sort of stumbling through speech manner, his way of speaking to suspects is to kind of put them off foot by kind of rambling and changing topics and kind of acting a bit disinterested, kind of coming off as a bit incompetent. But that's his way of putting them at ease and maybe hoping that they will lead the conversation for him and kind of reveal more than they were planning to. And it works really well, and it's really interesting to read. It was slightly annoying to read at some times, but for the most part I found the Kinderman scenes to be really well placed breaths of fresh air, usually coming off the back of some real horrifying stuff or some really tense scenes between Karras and Regan. And I think the Kinderman stuff was really well placed, and I really enjoyed it overall. And speaking of Regan, wow. Probably the scariest character I've read in a horror book. Just written fantastically in both kind of the little girl version and the possibly possessed person version are both just terrifying. The dialogues between Regan and the priest and Regan and some other characters are really chilling at times and really smart and clever. Regan as a character knows what, for example, Karras is trying to prove that this can't be a possession, and Regan is kind of leaning into that, giving him enough to think it might be, but then reminding him the reasons why it couldn't be, why this could all be mundane. And it's this very clever sort of, I don't know, Moriarty-ish rivalry going on there that is just exceptionally well written. And horror as a genre, I think, kind of struggles nailing the landing. A lot of horror books are fantastic in the start, drag a little bit in the middle, and then end fine. You know, a lot of even my favorite horror books have fine endings. They're endings that are perfectly serviceable. But at some point in a horror book, you have to let off the tension and let things come to a conclusion, and it's very, very, very hard to nail that. But I really think it happened here. I think this might be one of the best endings to a horror book that I've read. I don't know what reception to this was online. I haven't really looked, but I would be surprised if people had problems with the ending. I thought it was really, really well done. What else? The kind of secondary plots that are going on, the mysteries and the actions and conundrums that are going on that aren't directly related to the possession and exorcism question are actually pretty good. I found them to be engaging, but not so much they overshadowed the main plot. I found that they kind of complemented the main plot a lot, and that they were revealing just enough information to make you think different things were connected in different ways, to make you doubt the events that you're seeing are what you're actually seeing, or to make you doubt the events that are being portrayed truthfully, I should say. Just kind of stumbling around trying to avoid spoilers. But yeah, I thought they were all really good. I think a lot of the time in books, the B plots can be a bit meh. You can tell that they were added to try and, you know, up the page count or something. But here, I don't think any of that's true. I really do think that each plot point adds together and as a whole serves the greater narrative. As for things I didn't like, I really do only have one complaint, and I'm not knocking any points off the book for it, because really my only complaint is that at least in one small section of the book, I wish there was more book. And the way it is written in the book as it stands is fine. There's no problems there. I can see why it's done that way narratively. And even the bit that I wish was expanded upon, maybe it would have made it a worse book. Maybe people wouldn't have liked that as much as I would. But I'm going to describe it in, I genuinely think, very minor spoilery territory. But if you want to skip that entirely, jump straight to my final thoughts and rating. The timestamp is here. Pa-pow. Very light spoilers, I think. For most of the book, Karras is, as we've seen, trying to prove that this isn't a possession. Because he knows that he needs to convince, like, the diocese and the archbishop that this is a possession without any doubt, with any room for argument, if it's going to be approved. And in my mind, this was kind of like the, you know, like the boss of the first act or the second act was, if the first act is kind of convincing Karras that something needs to be done, the second act is convincing the archbishop that something needs to be done, and the third act is an exorcism. This is like the climax of Act 2 in my mind. And I think we kind of skip over it. In the book, it's kind of, we build up to it, you know. Chris will ask Karras, can you go to the Archbishop? And he'll be like, no, I can't, because he's going to ask this, 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 and this, and I don't have the answers for this, so we can't prove that this is a possession. Eventually, Karras becomes convinced. He sees enough evidence to think that an exorcism is warranted. And at this stage, I was hoping for that scene where he talks with the Archbishop. Instead, we get like barely even half a page of Karras saying, I'll convince the Archbishop, and then being told that yes, the Archbishop was convinced. I think this would have been a great spot for Karras to, lay the evidence out, recap the reader a bit, lay out, tell the Archbishop he thinks that an exorcism is required, and then have the Archbishop come back with the questions. Okay, well, Karras will be like, this is my evidence, and the Archbishop will be like, okay, well, that could be this, this, or this. How do you prove that this isn't mundane? How do you prove that this isn't something else supernatural? How do you prove that this is a possession by a demon? And I think that laying out of all the evidence in one page or, in one chapter would have been really interesting. I don't know why, but I find that sort of argument convincing one character really, really works in books for me. And this might just be a problem of the book was leading me to expect that, so when I didn't get it, I was disappointed. And I think we skip it to kind of keep the tension high going into the exorcism scenes, to kind of show that, at this moment of high tension, when Karras is convinced, it's of such high impact that we skip over all the bureaucracy, we just go straight to the action. And I think that's probably narratively wise, probably a better book the way it is, but I would have loved that scene with the Archbishop. All right, that's that. Spoilers aside, what did I think of this book? Look, I don't think it'll come as any surprise to anyone after watching this review. This book is getting a 10 from me. This is probably my favourite horror book now. I don't know if I've read anything that is genuinely as scary as this. I don't know if I've read anything that is as interesting and tense and engaging from start to finish in this genre than this. There are no characters here that I think feel superfluous. There's no plot points that feel unnecessary. Everything serves this greater narrative, and at the core of that narrative is Regan and Karras, two of my favourite characters from horror novels ever. So, you'll have to excuse me, it's Halloween. I'm going to go get candy ready, I'm going to go hang decorations, and I'm going to go watch The Exorcist. Have a great Halloween, everybody. Stay spooky, and most of all, remember to keep reading.